I wasn't the boss. I wasn't the heir. I was the quiet woman behind the numbers, the one who made everything work. They thought firing me would erase me, but the clock they wound for decades was always counting down to their own destruction. My name is Eleanor, Ellie Albright. Most people who run their world out of the high-rise steel buildings and golf course lunches will tell you that a major corporate life runs on contracts and handshakes. I can tell you the truth. It runs on coffee stains, misfiled intentions, and the silent compliance of the people you hire to do your quiet, messy bidding. I was one of those people. For 40 long, continuous years. I came from nothing, but I mastered perfection. And that made me the living database for Mr. Julian Thorne, the founder and formidable owner of Thorne Holdings. He was the public face of pristine finance. I was the backstage genius who filtered the truth from the lie, the mistake from the strategic misrepresentation. I worked through every holiday, every family crisis, every audit, all while operating without a single vacation day. The agreement was tacit, woven into the expensive wool of my salary. I give my silence and my skill, and in the end, my commitment will be acknowledged, securing my comfortable and dignified final years. It was the greatest and most foolish bargain of my entire life. At 68, the lines on my face aren't from laughter. They are deep, vertical grooves formed by constantly trying to project professional neutrality while watching pure greed play out on a daily basis. My existence was measured in what I absorbed and filed away, not what I voiced. The insults, small but persistent, piled up over the years like dust under the grand piano. Mr. Thorne rarely called me Ellie. I was the generic administrator, the executive function. But it was his grandsons, Rex and Leo, who perfected the art of high-class disrespect. Rex, a lawyer whose entire professional value rested on his name, loved to introduce me at company parties with a backhanded compliment that dripped condescension. "Oh, that's Ellie. She's been here forever. She manages to make our coffee exactly like it was made in the 70s. I think she brings a vintage flavor to everything she touches." Leo, less verbal but more visual, would frequently leave crucial, sensitive files dumped outside my office door for the cleaners, certain that I, the unpaid office janitor of confidentiality, would retrieve and sort them out. I filed their petty cruelty not under personal insult, but under character weakness, file 14B. I waited patiently, knowing my ledger of observation would eventually achieve the only equity that mattered. Thorne was, to the end, a strategist. His heart was failing, but his sharp, brutal mind was not. He lay on a silk chaise lounge, the blinds drawn in the crisis room, as I brought him his 7 p.m. water, a time slot I alone occupied. I knew his body was collapsing, but I was witnessing something colder and more terrifying, a calculating genius recognizing his own failure in life. He saw his grandsons not as his successors, but as his ultimate ruin, vultures who would consume his tainted empire in an orgy of carelessness. On that final, charged evening, he gave me no verbal thank you. No smile, just the truth. He dismissed the frantic, whispered conversations happening near the foyer. He simply gripped my hand, startling me with the final strength of a desperate man. From the hidden pocket of his bespoke jacket, he retrieved a complex, antique silver object. It was a locket of some kind, shaped like a circular watch face, its casing intricately engraved with obsolete clock gears. He folded my fingers around it tightly, and spoke in a whisper that barely carried. "Ellie, listen now. Pay attention. You, only you. I'm leaving the game. This is the one asset that must be protected. You know where to put the pieces together. It unlocks my final solution. Not for them, no. For my shame. It must be repaid." His words were faint, labored gasps. He didn't explain the meaning or the location. He just transferred the cold final command of a dying king to his loyal, ignored general. He slipped away, holding on to the secret, leaving me with the mysterious clock key. The shock of the exchange, the strange intimacy of that final transaction was overwhelming. But within a day, the clinical routine of my dismissal pushed the memory into the cold storage of professional anger. The estate attorney, Mr. Wallace, a man whose smile could freeze water, delivered my termination. It was a masterpiece of legal erasure. 40 years reduced to 2 sentences and a number on a cashier's check. Ellie. He even struggled to recall my first name. The trust recognizes your 4 decades of service compliance, a truly unique history. However, Mr. Thorne's direct successors, Rex and Leo, have concluded your administrative needs are, shall we say, minimalized. The severance package reflects this minimalized overhead. The check? $7,500 and 0 cents. My decades of brilliance, my integrity, my silence, my whole working life reduced to a mere $7,500. It wasn't just a low amount. It was a targeted insult. It was a financial bullet aimed squarely at my professional pride, screaming, "Your work was useless, and you are dispensable." They didn't even acknowledge the legal distinction of my actual chief financial steward duties. The severance document formally categorized me under residential household staff, unobtrusive administrative compliance, file number 2. My spine turned to concrete. I looked at the check, then at Wallace, then out the pristine window at Rex and Leo arguing over a golf course tea time. I realized the clock key was no longer a puzzle. It was a warrant. The pitiful check wasn't a payment. It was the required ignition, the necessary dose of extreme disrespect to turn an emotionally closed woman into an architect of justice. Thorne hadn't rewarded me. He had relied on my hatred of this humiliation to secure his ultimate revenge against his family. The old devil in his final calculation understood my professionalism more than his grandsons ever could. My silence was officially revoked. I was now engaged in the one and only project of my final working life, the complete and meticulous demolition of everything Thorne thought he controlled beyond the grave. And the clock was about to start a new, frightening countdown. I drove out of the city, not crying, but mentally preparing an entirely new ledger. My first job was locating the core vulnerability of the Thorne Citadel. The main central pillar they thought was impenetrable. The biggest fraud I'd helped them hide. My 40 years of absorbed knowledge screamed at 2 primary weaknesses: the stolen birthright and the dirty money. First, the stolen birthright. Thorne's only child, Miranda, was violently disinherited 30 years ago. The formal legal severance was messy, but appeared complete. However, I distinctly recalled Mr. Thorne lamenting a certain document regarding Miranda's daughter, Vera, stating, "If the trust isn't corrected after the fallout, she gets everything. Curse it." Rex and Leo believed all papers related to Miranda and Vera were destroyed. My file, marked CRY, Contingency and Reconciliation Y, told me otherwise. My professional sense of justice, of feeling long repressed, now aligned perfectly with the pure need for payback. Second, the dirty money. The bedrock of the Thorn fortune wasn't manufacturing, but a colossal 1980s toxic land sale, which I knew from filing classified contingency reports was covered up with federal regulatory bribes and shell corporation activity that continued to drain the primary trust. This wasn't merely bad business, it was indictable crime. The evidence, the real ledger that proved the crime was systemic, had never been turned over to the regular firm auditors. It only lived in my mind and in a secondary data stream I had created on my old work computer, the ghost server. The two secrets, the theft of family inheritance and the immense financial crime, were linked. The theft was the mechanism used to facilitate the crime, preventing the rightful heir from inheriting and thus exposing the company's true rot. I set up my computer in a low-rent temporary residence, where the silence of my task was only interrupted by the rhythmic clatter of an old air conditioning unit. Rex and Leo, arrogant and clumsy, had overlooked two crucial physical locations that the quiet life of an administrator made intimately familiar to me. I knew where they kept their most vulnerable secrets, not in a high-security vault, but right in front of them, concealed by years of routine. The Tower of Time, the grandfather clock, in the east foyer, where the clock key belonged. The mahogany file table in the sunroom, a desk that Rex hated and never used, but was Thorne's main hub for unscheduled handwritten confessions. My next step had to be swift, surgical, and silent. I was going to use their dismissal of me as my cover. No one looks for an aging woman whose purpose has been dissolved. I was officially a ghost, and the only power greater than authority is invisibility with malicious intent. I just had to decide which document to claim first. The humiliation of that $7,500 check fueled me. The quiet fire of my 40 years of unvoiced rage finally found its purpose. The complete and documented annihilation of everything that Julian Thorne had hoped to save for his final, undeserving heirs. My professional life had always been about the meticulous order of paper. My final act was going to be an irreversible chaos. The clock was counting down, and this time, no one would be able to pay the repair fee. The insult of the $7,500 check felt colder and heavier than the silver clock key resting on my pillow. That key was my clearance. The check was my incentive. I wasn't doing this for my past salary. I was doing it for my future silence, ensuring they never got another moment of peace from the consequences of my final move. My first act was reclaiming my expertise. Rex had been sloppy with the network password resets. A quick, subtle probe of my old remote access portal confirmed my hunch. His new security code was, laughably, the model year of his ridiculously loud sports car. The ghost server, my secret backup data stream of every transaction I had processed and corrected for 40 years, was intact. Every piece of paper, every dirty number, every hushed phone call, it all lived there, in my cloud. My archive was safe. The time for the physical extraction of the master ledger had arrived. I needed one final night in the Citadel. I coordinated with my retired old contact, Al, the locksmith. Using my inside knowledge of the estate's erratic schedule, a schedule only a former shadow would truly know, I selected a quiet Monday evening when Rex was always on a fishing trip and Leo was perpetually in a city high-rise gambling suite. The excuse was simple. Security check after the power grid glitch. I went in under the cover of a uniform and a fake service badge I'd designed on my home computer. The Thorn Citadel was dark, cavernous, and utterly quiet. The familiar scent of money, old leather, and a vague underlying chemical residue I'd long ignored hit me immediately. I was back in the belly of the beast. My target? The grandfather clock in the east foyer. I bypassed the perimeter security easily. The keycard code was a combination of Mr. Thorne's retirement year and his first dog's name, file 3C, pets. My heart wasn't pounding with fear, but with a cold, focused professionalism. This wasn't breaking and entering. This was retrieving an overdue file. The mahogany clock stood like a silent sentinel. I could see the fresh scuff marks around its base where Rex had clearly tried to drag it out for liquidation, but found it too heavy and decided it wasn't worth the effort. It was hidden by sheer disregard. They were blinded by the big numbers. They never bothered to check the little ones. I used the clock key. The fit was snug, perfect. The cold metal to the brass gear. The internal spring mechanism whined quietly, and a narrow drawer popped open from the side panel, hidden right there, in plain sight. Inside, protected in acid-free envelopes, lay the entire paper life of Julian Thorne, the ledger of absolute truth. It wasn't a digital file. It was physical, irrefutable paper, just as Thorne's old-world paranoid nature demanded. I placed the whole leather binder into my service satchel. But before I left, my peripheral vision, that silent observation tool that made me indispensable, caught a small, strange note stuck behind the velvet backing of the secret compartment. It wasn't formal. It was an instruction in Julian Thorne's nearly illegible handwriting. Use the woman who hates the truth most. She is the one I shielded for 35 years. Use her shame. JT. I knew who that referred to. Mr. Wallace, the attorney who handed me the meager check. Wallace wasn't merely complicit in the theft. Thorne believed Wallace was covering up some 30-year-old blunder of his own and was being blackmailed by Rex and Leo. Thorne, ever the manipulator, protected Wallace until the very end, perhaps hoping Wallace would also eventually betray the grandsons. Another chess piece in Thorne's final game, but a pawn now useless to me. I slipped out of the Citadel, moving like the shadow they always assumed I was. My final 20 minutes of employment, the 2 minutes I spent retrieving the file, would now determine the rest of their lives. Back at my anonymous temporary condo, I started the complete audit. The information from the ledger matching and completing the information on my ghost server. The discovery was less a surprise and more a sickening confirmation of a professional lifetime spent polishing rot. The papers screamed. The truth was shocking and immediate, expressed not in fancy codicils, but in plain, brutal accounting. The real cost of Thorne Holdings. What the ledger revealed, the stolen family line. The reckoning of Vera. Forget the simple last will they tried to enforce. The ledger contained a fully executed document, the Iron Will of 17. This will had a condition. It bypassed Rex and Leo entirely and left control of the core manufacturing assets, the clean money portion of the company, to his late daughter's son, Marcus. The reason Rex and Leo stole the paper? This will required an independent administrator, me, to confirm the disinheritance they pushed on the true heir, thus exposing their own actions. It proved Rex and Leo had knowingly forged documents and illegally severed a legal family claim just to protect their greedy inheritance. The environmental crime, the great lie of the 80s. The bulk of the ledger was dedicated to accounting for the toxic land sale cover-up. It was meticulous, listing names, dates, amounts, and jurisdictions. Thorne Holdings wasn't merely a tax cheat. It was a company that spent 2 generations covering up a massive felony, a contamination that endangered lives and involved widespread regulatory bribery and fraud. This wasn't just old news. This was active federal crime. The financial foundation of the company, the reason they were untouchable, was precisely the secrecy of this criminal cover-up. This evidence wasn't about civil court. It was about prison time for Rex and Leo. The traitor's proof, the final slap. The ledger contained a secret memo written by Julian Thorne just before his stroke. It didn't mention Rex and Leo's greed. That was assumed. It revealed that they themselves, Rex and Leo, had blackmailed Gaines to destroy a specific financial protection I had created, unwittingly linking them directly to the active cover-up of the toxic dump site. They were complicit from the beginning, using my honest filings as a weapon of their crimes. The puzzle was complete. Rex and Leo, seeing Thorne was failing, orchestrated the insulting dismissal to prevent any audit, banking on the simple greed of the ordinary employee. They chose a tiny bribe, $7,500, to secure a mountain of crime. But Thorne had set the whole thing up, ensuring that the disdain of his grandsons would unleash his most dedicated, silent observer, me, on their lives. My professional resentment and personal drive for vengeance were now seamlessly aligned with justice. I didn't need to steal money. I needed to deploy the facts. I needed to find the actual rightful heir, the victim of all this silence, Marcus Thorne. Using the ledger's confidential, non-listed contact information, I located him across the country. He wasn't living a grand life. He was an earnest construction manager, far removed from the rot, genuinely focused on real work. He needed to understand that the chaos I was about to unleash would also claim his quiet, peaceful life. The trauma would be immense, but the price of remaining silent was too high for both of us. The clock had started running against the Thorne citadel. I was now moving toward the final confrontation, armed with documents that had no price tag but carried infinite legal weight. The era of the unobtrusive administrator was officially over. The final confrontation was only days away, set for a mandatory legal discussion with Rex and Leo's attorneys. It was time for my silent reckoning to become a very public spectacle. The cleanup was about to begin. My final check of the documents confirmed what my decades of silent filing had already taught me. You don't beat criminals with emotion. You beat them with incontrovertible, documented fact. I had both. I arranged the confrontation through Marcus's newly retained, uncompromising legal team. The venue was neutral, but psychologically strategic. The polished boardroom of Rex and Leo's high-profile law firm, Stark and Chambers, a fortress they believed I could never breach. They had the numbers and the reputation. I had the ledger of absolute truth. I had also ensured the confrontation wouldn't be solely family business. Marcus's lawyer filed an initial, anonymous whistleblower tip, a vague complaint referencing the 1980s toxic land cover-up, with a specific environmental jurisdiction agency I knew Mr. Thorne despised. It was a pressure cooker. Rex and Leo walked into the mediation with a cloud of federal investigation already forming, a fact only I and the filing attorney knew. They assumed I was just a desperate former servant. The table was set for ruin. When I walked into the grand, intimidating boardroom, Rex and Leo didn't even stand. They stared with icy entitlement. They saw a woman they had successfully bought off for $7,500, an easy problem to solve with money. Rex smirked, his suit impeccable, his contempt heavy enough to be physical. Ellie, he dragged out my first name with distaste, we really are finished with this tiresome back and forth. Mr. Gaines assured me this woman has a ludicrous claim on the family's assets thanks to some delusional paper you dug up. Give us the paper and a non-disclosure and we'll bump the payout to a charitable $50,000. Leo, leaning back in his executive chair, didn't bother speaking. His silence, however, was as loud as his brother's snarl. He handed my $7,500 check to Mr. Gaines, now certified for payment, essentially making my settlement non-negotiable proof that I'd already agreed to my own erasure. The atmosphere was oppressive. The three Thorne men, their battery of legal muscle, the wood and the leather, it all screamed of power. But I was not intimidated. My years of unflinching observation had granted me immunity. I slid the original $7,500 check, the humiliation check, back across the polished table toward Rex. It stopped precisely at his well-manicured index finger. Mr. Thorne signed this as a receipt for services rendered. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, a clean accountant's tone. It cut through the room's entitlement. The room stilled. This was not the expected pleading. Rex laughed, loud and fake. Moral what? Elliot, call security. Get this administrator removed from the building immediately. The checkmate was already in motion. Marcus's environmental attorney intervened calmly. Security is not needed, Mr. Thorne. However, a new deposition is. My client is Marcus Thorne, the rightful heir of the will Omicron superseding all subsequent codicils, specifically citing your financial fraud as the reason for the final replacement. The revelation caused absolute chaos. Rex turned crimson, stumbling out of his chair. Leo's polished facade cracked instantly. The fear in his eyes was naked, a desperate child facing sudden ruin. The lawyers leaped in, shouting forgery and legal slander. I raised my hand, the universal sign for professional order. I hadn't spoken in an adversarial tone in 40 years, and the silence I imposed on them was more effective than any shout. Let's keep the documents clean, gentlemen. The will Omicron, while superseding the false will you tried to execute, is the minor problem. I opened the ledger of absolute truth, the final audit of silence. The major problem, the very foundation of the fortune you cling to, is this. Page 47, marked CAS. Covert Assets and Settlements. I pointed directly at the entry, confirming the toxic land deal cover-up. This record proves 2 generations of massive felony environmental fraud, a scandal you continued to maintain and mask. Rex and Leo, you had your attorney forge a document I was tasked to destroy, directly linking you to this felony. You signed an approval for ongoing liability expenditures, knowing those liabilities were payoffs for poisoning groundwater. Your inheritance isn't money, gentlemen. It's an indictment from the federal level. The atmosphere changed instantly, from aggressive defense to paralyzed fear. Their own lawyers, Gaines chief among them, suddenly stepped back, looking at Rex and Leo not as clients, but as sinking, toxic assets. No firm wants to be associated with an active, concealed environmental disaster that links back decades and involves money laundering. Gaines was shaking, remembering his own small sins that Julian Thorne knew about. I placed the original $7,500 check back on the table, face up. I looked at Rex and Leo, utterly defeated, understanding they'd made a catastrophic error in assessing the worth of an unobtrusive administrator. I reject this as insufficient payment for services rendered, I stated. I consider the total, irreversible public humiliation, criminal indictment, and documented financial destruction of the Thorne Citadel to be my final, full, and justly earned compensation. Your ruin is my only required annuity. It wasn't a boast. It was a verdict. It was the moment 40 years of banked suffering paid off its massive interest. I hadn't even taken a new title, yet I had become the single greatest financial and moral authority in that room. The meeting dissolved into legal anarchy, with lawyers frantically trying to establish privilege and containment. Too late. Rex shrieked at the futility, grabbing the check, cursing. Leo could only stare at the ledger, at the numbers that weren't just about money, but about decades of lives ruined by the fraud. The clock of the Thorne dynasty had finally run out of time. The retreat of the victor. The fallout was complete. The evidence I delivered to the federal authorities and the EPA was a steel wall. Rex and Leo's lawyers could do nothing but manage the inevitable surrender. The sheer depth of the conspiracy, proved by documents kept secret for 40 years by the asset without a title, left no room for legal maneuvering. The entire company became radioactive. The public exposure was magnificent. The Thorne Citadel crumbled in weeks. Rex and Leo faced not just massive civil lawsuits, but an indictment for corporate malfeasance and fraud. Prison time. They exchanged my meager check for decades of prison and a public shaming that stripped away every false piece of their legacy. Marcus, a man of integrity, successfully navigated the toxic acquisition of the remnants, primarily for the purpose of financing the massive environmental remediation mandated by the new court orders, cleaning up the core sin of the Thorne legacy. His first act, and final payment to me, was delivered by certified envelope, a complete, undisputed settlement document paying out the entire market value of the estate before its contamination, backdated to 1999, my full, true inheritance. No questions, no titles, just cash and silence. I accepted it. My dignity was satisfied. Now it was time for my freedom. Mr. Wallace, the now former attorney, managed to locate me once more. His eyes, once icy, now held respect, humility, and fear. Miss Ellie, my integrity. I apologize for my cowardice, but your judgment is absolute. Marcus needs your counsel, your knowledge. We want to install you as the confidential executive overseer of the new trust. Unlimited funds, total power. Please, come back and save this ship. I was not interested. My final accounting is closed, Mr. Wallace, I replied without hesitation. I corrected the errors I observed. The ship does not need a new admiral. It needs a full dry dock and decommissioning. My professional purpose is concluded. I liquidated every last bit of my assets, bought a discreet property deed in a remote foreign coastal town, a place where no one speaks English and no one knew the name Thorne, and left the checkbook on the bed. My wealth, secured through justice and ethical administration, now belonged entirely to my peace. I moved there, completely anonymous. The final sound I ever made in that old life was the small, quiet clink of the clock key, the tool that ended their world, when I dropped it into the city's main waste receptacle before boarding my flight. The irony was the perfect final seal. I became what they made me, a ghost, a legend no one could ever quite track down. I, Eleanor Albright, who had worked 4 decades for a single lie, found my truth in the utter solitude and irreversible ruin of the people who scorned me. I did not need a title. I did not need public praise. I simply needed justice, delivered by the silent architect who was dismissed but was never gone.